Let's turn this free stump into a beautiful vase. So the beginning of this story sounds a bit like a bad joke. I was driving down this country road when all of a sudden, but I did actually spot this free sign and one leftover chunk of a tree stump sitting there by the roadside. It was jagged and heavy and missing all of its bark, making it difficult to identify the species. But free is free, so I grabbed it to see if I could make something out of it. If not, it's still firewood and I could just throw it on the pile. Checking the weight, it comes in at just over 42 pounds or about 19 kilos, making it a beast to work with. I took the monster block down to the shop for some chainsaw surgery to get it trimmed down to a workable size. I thought I might be able to make it into a taller flower vase. The exterior-facing wood grain looked a bit like oak or ash, but when cutting into it, the shavings didn't carry that distinct oak fragrance. It definitely wasn't pine either, and it cut and felt a little bit like soft maple. In any case, the stump needed to be cut down into a smaller block that I could then process further with other tools. I moved the block over to the bandsaw, which was set up with a 3/4 inch resaw blade, and made some additional trim cuts. You can begin to see more evidence of why this tree was cut down. The missing bark usually means that the tree had been dead for a while, where the bark eventually flakes away on its own. But the spalting figure in the wood grain tells me that this poor guy fell victim to some sort of fungus. There's also some evidence of insect damage and staining, all indicating that half of this block had started to rot, which would make it potentially unstable on the lathe. Before attempting to turn this beast of a block, I'll set the bandsaw table at 45 degrees and trim off the square corners to hopefully save myself from getting smacked in the face by those big chunky corner cutoffs while using the lathe chisel. 2 minutes for illegal wood chips to the face. Hey, remember back in high school math class thinking you'd never use any of that geometry crap? Like being able to find the center of an irregular form? Man, was I wrong. So goofball me did his best to center the mounting plate and minimize the rotational vibration on the lathe. Though I thought it was pretty well centered, little did I know at the time that the spalted half of the block weighed significantly less than the opposite side. The imbalance and vibration fought me throughout the initial shaping. Well, the species of this freebie roadside stump still has me baffled a bit. It didn't have any bark on it, so it was hard to identify the tree that way. And just looking at the outer grain when I first took the chainsaw cuts to it, it kind of looked like either oak or ash. But once I started to cut into it, it took on this light reddish brown tone to it, which makes me think of cherry, although I think the stump was too big for it to be cherry. If you turn it, there's grain lines that make it look like poplar. And this is a little bit softer than a typical hardwood, so it might be poplar with a different coloration on this side. As we get closer to the sapwood, there are parts of the tree that have this discolored spalting in the actual wood grain. So I think this is probably what killed the tree. So I'm not completely sure what we have yet, but it's kind of pretty. The other thing that's kind of satisfying about turning a green piece of wood is that it's relatively easy to cut into, and the shavings are nice and consistent and long and stringy, kind of like spaghetti. So it was fun to do the rough cut on this vase. It had been a pretty long day, now close to 7 p.m., and it was time to call it quits for the evening. The next morning, I thought I would take some initial readings and measurements for moisture content and water weight of this rough turning. If you don't already know, you shouldn't really turn your final shape on the lathe until the wood is completely dry. Otherwise, it tends to warp and potentially crack. The rough cut vase is at about 20 to 22% moisture content and weighs in at about 2,400 grams. To simply air dry this vase before its final turning might take a couple years. I'm going to push that timetable with an experimental drying method using silica gel to absorb the moisture. I'm also going to pre-treat the end grain with a product called pentacryl, which seems to work magic stabilizing the wood fibers and prevent them from cracking. I'll brush it on the top and bottom of the vase and let it soak in. By example, here's a wood round, sometimes called a cookie, treated with pentacryl, and although it's 2 years old, it never cracked. For the experimental drying process, I'm going to use regular silica gel cat litter and a plastic paint bucket with a rubber seal lid. You can also buy color-changing silica gel, which is more expensive, but this should work fine. It will actually absorb its own weight in water and can then be recharged or dried in the oven for another project. I'll add some other dry wood blocks to take up some volume and then pour the silica gel all around and inside the vase. With a quick zoom view into the bucket, I'll get this bucket lid hammered on tight and then just wait, I guess. And finally, you got to do what your mama taught you and put your toys away. Come on back to see how our experimental drying method turns out. Thanks for watching. Stay frosty.